Hi, I'm Nathan from Serious Geeks, and this video is going to be about how to choose your secondary objectives in games of Warhammer 40,000 9th edition. The secondary objectives available in the Warhammer 40,000 main rulebook are crucial to making a more dynamic, fair and balanced game of Warhammer 40,000 for both players in general. Of course, nothing is perfect, but these missions do go a long way to ensuring that both players have a reasonable chance of winning games, or at least giving a good game, against armies that may in the past be extremely skewed against them. First, a quick explanation. The secondary objectives I will be referring to can be found in Chapter Approved 2020. This is the Grand Tournament edition, and it is the most competitive sense of 40k. The missions are largely the exact same as those found in the main rulebook. However, they have a little bit more nuance to it and a little bit of change that does make it a little bit more balanced for most players to play. The things I will discuss in this video are definitely relevant to the main rulebook secondary objectives, so you can take a lot what I say here and transfer it to there. Indeed, some of those objectives are exactly the same, word for word. So, without further stalling for time, let's get into it. When it comes to your secondary objectives, there are no objectives that you should take as a matter of course in every game without even thinking about it. There'll always be some that are better suited to your army than others, and they might be the ones that you first lean towards, but you never know which opponent you're going to come up against, especially in a competitive sense. And as such, it's highly recommended that you give a good think to each of the objectives, just in case that you can make better use of one over another, depending on your opponent. Whenever a player builds an army, it will have its own strengths and weaknesses, regardless of its race or codex that it's taken from. Indeed, some codex books could be wildly different in application but have similar strengths and weaknesses. This is especially true when it comes to taking and holding objectives or killing the enemy. The best thing to remember here is that your opponent has the exact same conundrum as you. How is he or she going to score victory points off your army? Will they go for as many kills and damage as possible to score as many points that way, or will they try to take a bit of board control and score points without actually engaging you because you seem to have a bit of an edge? You may have skewed your army in such a way that they don't have the tools to defeat it, not in the open field. You may find that you don't really fancy taking on that knight army on equal footing, trying to just trade blows with it, simply because you've taken a rather balanced list that doesn't have quite as much anti-tank in the shooting sense, and will have to get up close and obviously weather a lot of firepower and take a lot of hits from the shooting phases, just because you're trying to assault and do a lot of your damage that way. So you may think, well, you know what, in this case I might spread out and go for as many victory points in that manner. Likewise, that knights list may not be very well suited to taking loads of objectives because it just doesn't have the numbers, but it might be very good at getting across the board very quickly, because they are generally quite fast units, to score victory points in your deployment zone, to take objectives off of you and to be able to actually kill as many models as possible. There's a lot of nuance here and there's a lot of variables, so the best thing I'm going to do is discuss each of the secondary objectives and what circumstance I think it's best to take that particular objective for what kind of army. This will also include touching upon what kind of opponent they're likely to be up against. Please note, I'm not going to discuss the secondary objectives that could be found on the missions for Chapter Approved 2020, just because there are a hell of a lot of missions there and a lot to discuss, and there are a lot of variables, so it's probably best to discuss that in its own video, and it warrants a discussion at a later date. So, starting from the top, we have from the Battlefield Supremacy section, Engage on all fronts. Engage on all fronts is an interesting objective in that it rewards players for being spread across the table and for generally having quite a large number of units. Yes, it is possible to score victory points using this objective with a very small number of units. However, it can be expected that the opponent will be aware of this and be trying to kill your models as well. As such, if you lose any units, you cease to score. This secondary objective rewards players gradually over the course of a game. If you have 3 different units in 3 different table quarters, more than 6 away from the centre, you will score 2 points at the end of your turn. If you have 4 units in 4 different table quarters, it goes up to 3 points. Units also have to be wholly within 1 table quarter, they can't be straddling 2. As such, you can't double up with 1 unit scoring by going in 2 different table quarters. This generally means you need a decent number of units to be able to score this objective. In addition, you have to actually be in these table quarters. which means advancing towards the opponent. I doubt you'll see many Tau players using this objective, simply because they don't want to be advancing too close to the enemy, and if they are going to be doing that, they might suffer quite a few losses on the way in. They'll be open to being charged, and they won't be able to concentrate their firepower as easily. An army that isn't very mobile cannot score early enough to make this worthwhile. If you're only in those different table quarters for 2 or 3 turns, you're only going to be earning 2, 4, 6, maybe 9 victory points. It isn't an insignificant amount, but it's not game winning on its own. There could be circumstances where 6 victory points or 9 victory points, whatever, could be quite relevant to your army's winning chances. However, there's probably points that you could score from other secondary objectives that might be a little bit better suited to your army. So, what kind of armies and lists do I recommend that should take engage on all fronts? Well, because you have to get into 3 or more table quarters, and you have to do it fairly quickly to score as many points as possible, an army that is quite fast or has very solid deployment options would be well suited to this objective. You also want to have a large number of units, so you can't lose a few and then be incapable of actually scoring the points. So this leads itself to armies such as Genestealer Cult, White Scars perhaps, because they do spread across the board very quickly, and you can do so in a fairly large number of quite survivable models, such as bikes. Both Orcs and Tyranid armies have a lot of access to cheap troops that can enable them to have enough models to continually hold these table quarters, whilst also providing an assault element that will engage the opponent and thus move into their table quarters they might be holding. And potentially Astra Militarum, because although they're not particularly good getting up close and assaulting the opponent, they do have a lot of weaponry, which means they can use plasma guns, melter guns and flamers to get up close and use them. They will be trying to take objectives, and at the end of the day they've got a lot of models and a lot of variants as well. You can have a lot of infantry combined with armoured vehicles that enable you to take a lot of beatings, and you can spread around the table and make sure you score points even when you're losing models. Lastly, for engage on all fronts, remember, the primary objectives will be stationed around the board. So if you're going to be taking the primary objectives, consider if they are in different table quarters, exactly where your units are, and if you can score twice, once for the primary objective and once for this secondary objective. Next up is Linebreaker. Linebreaker is a typically 40k mission in that it requires a unit, in this case 2 units, to get into the opponent's deployment zone at the end of your turn, scoring you 4 points. Note that aircraft cannot score in this manner. Whether this secondary objective is well suited to your army is relevant to just how fast your units may be, or if they have decent deployment options. If you can get 2 units into the enemy deployment zone for just 3 turns, you're going to score a decent 12 points. You don't even have to be there for very long, therefore you can still score 8 points just for 2 turns. This obviously favours fast moving armies, but also units that may deploy by drop pod as an example, or teleport in. Genestealer Cult again could score quite well with this one. Remember, even if you can't score it turn 1, but you reckon you can score it in subsequent turns, you don't lose out on any points because you score such a large amount at the end of 1 turn. You only need 3 turns to score above 10, which is quite significant. Armies I highly recommend not taking this would be Knights. Getting 2 units into the enemy deployment zone isn't actually a very difficult way of scoring your points. However, the moment you lose 1, you're not going to score any. You need at least 2. 1 will not be enough. For other armies, consider taking this if you've got quite an aggressive force, or you've got the aforementioned fast or decent deployment options for your army. Remember, if you're trying to crack into a Tau castle or get close to those Astra Militarum and they're all camping in their deployment zone, you're probably going to want to actually score points while you're in there anyway. Again, if your army is quite a defensive army, or it might be Tau, and you might not want to get into the opposing deployment zone and take a beating in close combat, then this is not the secondary objective for you. The last secondary objective in the Battlefield Supremacy section is Domination. This objective is very interesting. This one encourages you to take more than half of the objectives for the primary mission. If you do this, you will be scoring big numbers of victory points quickly through the primary objectives and also from this one. Again, it is a gradual amount. You get 3 at the end of your turn if you have more than half of these objectives. However, it can add up, and if you are holding primary objectives to win the game, this one will help cement the amount of victory points you're scoring. This is another one of those objectives that are really good for people who are fighting small elite armies. Those small elite armies are trying to kill as many of your units and models as possible, and you can spread around the board to slow them down doing that, and whilst you're doing that, you're going to be scoring more points, and this one assists you in doing so as well. Something to bear in mind, the opponent is well aware of your secondary objectives, so units that are on the objective markers will be a high priority target. Transports are a really good option here. They keep units alive for longer. When you're on board a transport, you're not being targeted, and they also enable you to reach those objective markers and score points a lot earlier, and therefore you get your points a lot quicker before the opponent has actually had a chance to bring his forces to bear to take you off the objectives. This secondary objective is a lot more useful to more armies simply because it is more relevant to the primary objectives you're trying to score anyway to win the game, and as such you're more likely to advance towards them rather than assault the opponent if you're a more defensive army, for example. When not to choose this objective, apart from when you've not got many units, is when you don't think you can hold more than half of the total primary objectives in any one turn, simply because the opponent is doing the exact same thing. Combined arms approaches do work well with this objective. It enables you to be able to take the fight to the enemy whilst holding objectives and doing a bit of everything, and if you can get more objectives than the opponent, then that is always a positive thing to win the game anyway. Lastly, this secondary objective is a really good counter to armies that might just want to sit there and take you off the table with shooting. They're not moving, they're not taking the objectives, so you're going to be scoring more, and it's a great counterfoil to that in a tournament scene. Working our way down through the book, we have No Mercy and No Respite. This section is all about killing things. The very first of these secondary objectives is Thin Their Ranks, which is a traditional 40k kill points type scenario. The way that this objective works is you count each model that you kill, models with 10 wounds or more count as 10, and then you divide them at the end of the game by 100 and round down. This is the total amount of victory points you will score for this objective. As you can see, this is geared up to when you face a large number of models or a large number of very cheap and relatively easy to kill vehicles. Great example of this would be Astra Militarum, that may have several infantry squads inside chimeras, which are all relatively easy to kill in comparison to larger vehicles such as the Leman Russ. Orc hordes, Tyranid hordes, Genestealer cult, all can have a very large number of models, and if you can kill a large number of these models, then you can score a lot of points. If your army isn't particularly killy, and by that I mean it doesn't have a large capacity to kill a lot of models very quickly, then this is not the objective for you. In addition, if your opponent is very elites heavy, has a lot of characters, or a lot of vehicles that are way above 10, so say a Land Raider or a Leviathan or Knights, it's also not really recommended to take this objective, simply because the efficiency of killing those units will not net you enough victory points to warrant the effort put into it. The very next secondary objective is Grind Them Down. Grind Them Down is another very straightforward objective. At the end of the battle round, if your army has killed more enemy units than they have in turn killed of you, you will score 3 victory points. This is a direct counter to what we often see described on the internet as multiple support units and that style of play, MSU. These type of armies consist of very small units in large numbers, most often minimum squad sizes. Armies that fall into this category are most notably Space Marines. They usually have quite a large number of units, but a very small number of actual models on the table. Other armies you might consider this objective against are things like Genestealer cult or Astra Militarum that have large numbers of infantry squads. Basically, any army that has lots of troops with very small numbers of models that are easy enough to kill. Take this objective if the opponent has a lot of units on the board and you fancy your chances of being able to cull their numbers fairly rapidly. If you look at your opponent's army and you think they will lose units a lot quicker than what you will, then this is definitely the objective for you. Armies that will heavily favour this objective will be Adeptus Custodes and Knights, simply because they are incredibly elite-based armies, and as such, they will kill most enemy units a lot quicker than what they will lose models themselves. One last little point I'd like to add to this is pace yourself. If the opponent has lots of quite easy models to destroy in very small units, but they will run out eventually, then sometimes you could just kill 1 or 2 of those units a turn just to top up how many you've killed elsewhere, and that could actually be sufficient to give you the edge each turn on a turn-by-turn basis, scoring you the points you need to win the game. The very last of the Battlefield Supremacy secondary objectives is While We Stand, We Fight. This objective is different from all the others in this category in that it rewards you for having models that survive at the end of the game, rather than destroying enemy models. You select the 3 most expensive models in your army, and those models must survive to the end of the game, and each one that does will net you 5 victory points. This objective is not very easy to win with, simply because the enemy is going to try and kill your units, and if you have really expensive models you want to get the best out of them, you shouldn't be hiding them at the back of the table, hopefully keeping them alive long enough to net you 5 victory points. Hiding your expensive units at the back of the table means you're not going to be using them, and if you're not going to be using them, you're going to have a points deficit in comparison to your opponent. Of course, there will be circumstances where taking this secondary objective will be beneficial to your army. You might have a large number of very cheap troops, in which case your expensive models are fairly predictable in that they're usually characters as opposed to large vehicles that you have to get a bit of usage out of. Your army might have a lot of survivability. You might be able to really put a lot of difficulty into your opponent's ability to kill certain units and models, and therefore you might have the capacity to keep that Leviathan alive, and if you lose it, you're probably going to lose the game. So in these sort of circumstances, sometimes it can be worthwhile choosing this secondary objective, but for the most part, it will be when you have an absolute monster ton of models, and you can hide a relatively expensive but still comparatively cheap model behind your back line when it's in nice obscuring terrain, and not lose the unit or the model simply because you don't need to use them. The next section is Purge the Enemy. Opening up with Titan Hunter, this one is fairly self-explanatory just by the name. This one works by rewarding you 10 victory points at the end of the game if you've destroyed a single enemy model with the Titanic keyword. If you've destroyed 2, you will be rewarded with 12 victory points, and if you destroy 3 or more enemy models with the Titanic keyword, you will be rewarded with the full 15 victory points possible for this secondary objective. The best advice I can give for when to take this secondary objective is when the opponent has enemy Titanic units that are killable by your army, 1 or more of them. 10 victory points is not to be sniffed at, so if you think you can kill 1 knight in the opposing army and they only have a single Titanic unit, then go for it. Naturally, if you come up against an entire knight army, or you come against a Astra Militarum with several Baneblades, this could be a very handy secondary objective to choose, simply because you're going to score those points killing those models anyway. However, if you don't fancy your chances killing knights or Baneblades or any Titanic unit, don't take it. It will just hurt your chances of scoring victory points because you're not going to kill the model. An example of this would be, say, a Knight Castellan in a Space Marine army. It's at the back of the army and you won't be able to get it, perhaps. You might not be able to reach it, you might not be able to have the firepower to put it down, so choosing this secondary objective would not be the best choice in that circumstance. That's probably all I can really say about this one. I suppose it does go without saying, if the enemy doesn't have any Titanic enemy units, you may as well not choose this secondary objective. Similar to this one though is Bring It Down. This one's a great one to use if the opponent has a lot of enemy units that are vehicles or monsters, especially ones that are 11 plus in wounds, but don't sniff at an army that may have lots of smaller vehicles or smaller monsters, because you can still accrue 2 victory points for killing them. This is a great secondary objective to choose if your opponent has a lot of vehicles on the table, especially transports, or they might have a combined arms approach but have several cheap vehicles alongside a few slightly heavier ones. An example of that may be a Space Marine army that has a couple of rhinos, Dreadnought perhaps, drop pods. All these sort of units are fairly easy to kill comparatively to some of the many big ones of the 41st millennium, such as a Leviathan or a Knight or a Land Raider, or even Leman Russ battle tanks. An army full of vehicles that you have a good ability to destroy will net you 2 points per model, or 3 if they're slightly heavier. It goes without saying that you shouldn't take this secondary objective if you're up against an army that doesn't have any vehicles or monsters. And if you're up against an army that is a knight army, which actually has several large vehicles, it's also not worth taking because you're only going to accrue 2 points, or 3 points in this case, per vehicle. And scoring a maximum of, say, 6 or 9 victory points isn't necessarily what you want to achieve. But, it can be topped up with other secondary objectives, so it could be useful. So it's something to bear in mind, but I wouldn't recommend it. As always, remember you've got to actually kill these enemy models. So if your army has concentrated a lot on board control and has a lot of anti-infantry firepower and capacity, it's not something you're going to be able to achieve very easily. So I wouldn't recommend taking it in that circumstance either. Cut off the head is the very next objective that we can have a look at. And I must say, I don't really recommend this in just about any circumstance for any army. If you look at it, to score the maximum amount of points you can from it, you have to kill the enemy warlord very early. The later you kill the enemy warlord, the smaller return your victory points will be from the secondary objective. From about turn 3 onwards, it ceases to be relevant. It's just such a small amount of victory points, you could probably get more elsewhere from a different secondary objective. Just about any army can. The one exception to this, I would say, is if your opponent has a very prominent warlord that is easy to target turn 1. Knights spring to mind here, but there may be a circumstance where you might have drop pods as an example, and the opponent has a very easy to access warlord and you could probably get him and kill him, but I really don't recommend it. I think that for the most part you're never going to use this one, simply because you just can't get to the guys that you need to kill quick enough. Anyway, last up on Purge the Enemy is Assassinate. Unlike the previous one, where you have to slay the enemy warlord, this one is actually very useful. If the opponent has a lot of characters, you can net a lot of victory points on this. Armies that rely on characters, such as Genestealer cults or Blood Angels that often have a lot of assault-based characters that are buffing all the troops around them, these armies will really suffer when you start to cull their important linchpin models. And they're getting hit twice. You're scoring victory points off it, and the opponent is losing the benefit of those models. If the opponent has a lot of character models, but they are perhaps some sort of gun line, like the Astra Militarum, might have an all-infantry army with very few vehicle support, then you might not be able to get to those characters, especially if you have an army that is very similar and has to try and outshoot them. So in those circumstances, I wouldn't bother taking this. Similarly, I wouldn't take it against knights, and I probably wouldn't take it against any army that doesn't have at least 5 characters, to be honest. 4 at a push. You want to score 12 victory points from your secondary objectives most games to try and cement your chances of winning. And of course, you're not going to win every game with every single secondary objective maxed out, but you want to have the capacity to max out each of them. Otherwise, choose a different one. Some armies really excel at assassinating characters, so they will naturally gravitate towards this as soon as there's 3 or more characters on the board, and that's relevant. I mean, if you can get it easily and then max out elsewhere, then you can potentially have a bit of a tactic and strategy involved here. But for the most part, wait and see how many character models the opponent has. If they have an aggressive enough army for you to reach, or if you have an aggressive enough army to reach them, then it's relevant. If not, choose something else, go for a bit of board control. Moving on to our second to last category, we have shadow operations. Nothing really covert about these, it's more or less miscellaneous. Raise the banners high, the very first one, is a very interesting one that is quite useful if you're taking objectives anyway, with lots of units. So if you don't have very many units and you need to trade some blows with the opponent, putting a unit, say, of 10 Terminators on an objective and get them to raise a banner is kind of wasteful. Yes, they're scoring a victory point, but you do not need this. If you do have some cheap enough troops to be able to accompany them while you're doing that, then all the better. But for the most part, elite armies will probably struggle to get the most out of this particular objective. If you have a surplus of models, then this secondary objective is ideal for you. If you can get a lot of units on the board, and some of them might not need to shoot, then yeah, go for it. I say Orc armies, Astra Militarum, Genestealer cults, some Eldar builds, or Eldari if you want to be particular. Adeptus Mechanicus, they can have a lot of troops on the board. Yeah, it depends on what you're doing, but for the most part, if you're trying to trade blows with the opponent and you think you're going to have a battle on your hands, this one isn't for you. If you have to spread across the table anyway, and you're not going to be trading that many shots with the opponent, at least not for early game, then this could be potentially useful. But like I said, choose it very carefully. Investigate sites is kind of the sister to that one. except that it's probably more useful for an elite-based army, because an elite-based army will want to get to the centre of the table for some board control and launch its attacks towards the enemy, either assault-based or close-range firepower, so they often do operate in the middle of the table anyway. When this is the case, this is where Investigate Sites becomes very useful. Only a single unit has to do it, has to be in the centre of the board, and you get 3 points for it. So do it for 3 turns and you've got 9, which is quite respectable. It also means that you can sacrifice just one cheaper unit to do so, potentially in a vehicle transport to get there early and then be protected from line of sight. The rest of your elite army can run interference and can distract the opponent in other ways by going for other victory conditions, so this one is very relevant to more players than what they actually may realise. A lot of people gravitate away from having to have a unit sacrifice all of its actions to score some victory points, but this one can work. That's what scouts are for after all. Probably goes without saying you don't want your knights to be doing this one. Let's be honest, you spent a lot of points on those knights and a lot of money. And if they're just standing around doing nothing because one of them wants to stand in the middle of the table and claim it, you ain't going to win the game because you're probably already outnumbered. This is one for any army that can hold the centre of the table, but I recommend it mostly for elite armies that will want to hold the centre of the table, or assault-based armies that will want to move towards the centre of the table, at least initially. Armies that will not appreciate this one will probably be Tau gun lines, Astra Militarum that are quite defensive, and some Space Marine builds that don't want to advance towards the enemy that much, especially to an assault-based force that has the edge on them. People fighting Blood Angels probably should avoid this one as well. My summary for this one is basically it's really good if you're going to be advancing towards the enemy anyway, and you plan on holding the centre of the table. If you're fighting an assault-based army and you don't think you can hold the centre of the table, don't take this secondary objective. And if you're a Knights player, definitely don't take it. You need to be able to kill as many models as you can, as quickly as you can, because you're outnumbered. Don't waste a 600 odd point vehicle doing nothing for an entire turn and have to do it 3 or 4 times a game. Next up we have Deploy Scramblers. This one looks to be quite a difficult one to achieve. Assault armies would probably have the best chance of doing it, and that's pretty much it. You have to have a unit that is an infantry unit, excluding characters, deploy their scramblers by taking an action within their own deployment zone, in the opponent's deployment zone, doesn't have to be the same unit, and then once more outside either player's deployment zones at least 6 inches away. It's not impossible. In fact, it's a lot easier than it looks because it's at the end of your movement phase the unit action is begun, which means they can move to that section first. So it is very achievable. It's just it's not easy to do necessarily if you have to plan for it. However, if the opponent hasn't got the capacity to stop you from getting into the enemy deployment zone, their deployment zone, then it could be worthwhile, especially if you have, say, a drop pod and a unit on board that could actually potentially just take that little action at the end of their movement phase. If your army's not that aggressive, you don't want to use this one. I imagine Genestealer Cult would probably use this quite often, as would many assault forces, but Astra Militarum and probably Tau might not be that keen on it. The very last one of this section is called Teleport Homer, and it is quite difficult to do for most armies. You do net a decent amount of victory points each time you successfully complete this action. 4 victory points is nothing to be sniffed at. However, to make it worthwhile, you have to do it several times in a game, and getting into the enemy deployment zone just to achieve this objective is not going to be easy for most players, especially as it means that you can't shoot or attack the enemy. Of course, there are some circumstances where this might be quite useful. If you're against, say, a Blood Angels opponent and you have a lot of models that can get into the enemy deployment zone later on in the game, it might be worthwhile. They're all coming to you, so you force them to come backwards. Genestealer Cult spring to mind, they can end up anywhere. They can commit to getting their models and units within a deployment zone fairly regularly, and as such, they can score those 4 points each turn until they get to the maximum 15, or perhaps just stop at 12. So yeah, there are some options for some armies to take this secondary objective and probably thrive with it, but for most of us, I don't think it's going to be that efficient. I think it's going to be quite difficult to score more than once or twice in a game, and as such, it's probably not worth your while taking this in most armies. Go for a different secondary objective. Warpcraft is the very last one, and it starts off with quite an obvious one. Abhor the Witch, which is very Black Templar, and I think many of those players will be rubbing their hands with glee. If you have no psykers yourself and the opponent does, you can take this one and score victory points for killing psykers. You score 3 victory points if you kill a unit of psykers, and if it has the character keyword, you score the full 5. So it's quite easy against an all psyker army to accrue the full 15 fairly regularly. Unfortunately, if you have just a single psyker, you cannot take this victory condition, so it's pretty much for Tau, Necrons, Black Templars players, and people who've just not taken any psykers. Some armies will never use it. Consider Tyranids, Eldari, Genestealer Cult, Thousand Suns, Grey Knights. They will never ever use this secondary objective. For the rest of us who might be a bit in between, you might take one psyker, some games you might not bother. It's very circumstantial. You'll have to really judge it, see if the opponent has enough psykers to make it worthwhile. 1 or 2, maybe not. If you have psykers, you just won't touch it. So yeah, judge it as and when you come up against a circumstance where you might be able to use it. If not, don't worry about it too much. Next up, we have a Mental Interrogation, which is an easy psychic power to cast at Warp Charge 4. A psychic character aims it at an enemy character, and for every successful cast each game, you score 3 victory points. Could be useful, especially if you have quite a lot of psychic powers and a lot of characters on the board who are able to cast it, or if you just haven't got much use for your psyker apart from scoring victory points. I mean, a victory point scoring machine isn't terrible, but it could be a waste of points if you've invested a lot in it. Circumstances like a single librarian who has, in the tournament circumstance, taken 2 powers that are okay but not brilliant against his opponent may like this because they can score some victory points each turn and it'll make a bit of a difference. If you have some cheap characters, like Orcs, they have access to a lot of cheap characters, or Astra Militarum, again, this could be quite useful because it's a way of accruing victory points in circumstances when you just need to get those 3 points each turn, and it can add up quite quickly. However, 3 points a turn does mean you have to successfully cast it 5 turns a game, and the opponent could try and dispel it, nullify it, by denying the witch, and you could also fail it. It's very possible. So you got to bear in mind you're not going to accrue a lot of victory points with this every game, but it could accrue 6 or 9 victory points quite consistently. One thing I would like to recommend is the use of this if you think you can score victory points elsewhere to win you the game, and you could use this kind of as a red herring, a distraction to the opponent. Get them to use their limited deny the witches on this, and then you can use another power. Again, that's quite circumstantial, so you'll have to judge that for yourself, and bear in mind the opponent has to have enough characters close enough for you to cast it. So it's not always an easy one to use this. This one will often be used by, I'd imagine, Thousand Suns or Grey Knights players who have access to a lot of psykers and a lot of powers and don't necessarily have to cast a power with each one of those models every game. So there's always a model spare ready to cast Psychic Interrogation, which could be a nice little strategy for most people. Because let's be honest, if you've got an opponent who only has 1 librarian to defend against all your Thousand Sun psykers, he's probably going to be worried about a couple of powers, so he might let Psychic Interrogation go. So it's a good option in that regard. For the rest of us, we have to think very carefully and would probably not take this very often. Now, Psychic Ritual is a very interesting one. It only has to be performed 3 times, which is still quite a large amount in a 5-turn game, but it only requires 1 psyker to achieve, and they have to be in the centre of the table. So if you have board control, you can actually dedicate yourself to scoring 15 victory points by 1 psychic character using Psychic Ritual in the centre of the table. And yeah, that could be quite decisive, especially in a competitive sense. 15 points is quite a large number to get at the end of the game. And yeah, I would recommend this if you can control the centre of the table, and you have a psyker, of course. You might not want to use this against assault-based armies. They'll just rush into you and get you. You might not have cast it enough, so yeah, I wouldn't recommend it against assault-based armies, and I wouldn't recommend it if you can't control the centre of the table. The very last secondary objective we're going to cover in this whole section, and indeed this video, is Pierce the Veil. This is another one that is very difficult to score. You have to be completely within the opponent's deployment zone and more than 6 away from enemy models to be able to cast it. The enemy could very well deny the witch, which would ruin your chances of using it for another turn, and you might just fail it yourself. so I wouldn't recommend this. It's just very hard to get anything out of. There are some circumstances where you might find it useful, such as if your Genestealer Cult army, put a model up on that side of the table, or you've dropped someone down later on in the game who could cast it, but casting it more than twice to score the high victory point total that you need from it, it's going to be quite difficult. Not much to say on that one, I'm afraid. It's very difficult to use, and I don't think many people would use it outside really specific circumstances. Anyway, on that note, that is all of them. I've covered all of the secondary objectives. I'm sorry it's such a long video, but there's a lot to cover. I hope I've managed to give people a little bit of insight on when to take these secondary objectives and in what circumstances not to. And I hope that it's useful for players, I really do. So please let me know what you think in the comments below, and I will speak to everyone soon. Peace out.